The population of the world is rising at an alarming rate. In fact, at 1.1% per year, which when put into numbers is an extra 70 million people on Earth per year, which equates to the population of Thailand, which in turn means another 70 million mouths to feed. With so many people on Earth and only a limited range of resources to feed them, world hunger is fast becoming a global problem, both in developing countries and the more prosperous and wealthy ones.
We've got to take food waste off the menu. A world in which 1 billion people are hungry, a world in which we have an environmental crisis largely brought about by the way in which we grow food, is not a world in which wasting a third of the world's food supply is any longer acceptable.
Well, the impact of the COVID-19 virus has also taken its toll on, obviously, hunger issues. For example, in the UK, many children going without meals when in school, which for many was their one and only meal per day, and required the intervention of a professional footballer to persuade the government to provide food vouchers for children, following an initial decision to block the vouchers.
Well, basically, I'm just hoping that the government make a U-turn on the decision to stop the free meal vouchers, and I'm just hoping they do it as soon as possible. Really, I know they've mentioned that they usually do this, this time of year, summer holidays, but because of COVID, the situation's been completely different for everyone in the world.
Hello and welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kabatahwe. This week's show, we'll be looking at world hunger, and we will study just how deep a crisis the world is in, with contributing factors including a rising global population, conflict, and of course, the COVID-19 virus, all of which have played a part in people going hungry. Don't forget, Economic Divide is your show, so why not join us on the program? Just drop us a line via our Twitter feed, @ED_program, and let us know what you want to share with us. We'd be honored to hear your views. Well, the figures surrounding the food shortages around the world are staggering, with every corner of the globe affected by the issue. It is estimated that some 821 million people in the world are labeled as food insecure, with the situation likely to get worse in the next few months unless something is done. As things stand, 1 out of every 9 people in the world go to bed hungry each night, including some 20 million people who are currently experiencing or are at risk of famine, and surprisingly, not all of them are in developing or global south countries. The impact of the coronavirus, as mentioned, has been devastating for people, especially when it comes to, of course, food. It has affected some 55 countries, and countries have reached critical levels of food shortages in terms of how many people who have been affected, 135 million, on top of the already 130 million who were on the edge of starvation. That's an additional 265 million hungry people on the list solely for the impact of COVID-19.
There's no escaping the images of starving children, failed crops, and the anguish that can be seen in places like Africa, West Asia, and around the world when it comes to hunger. For decades, the developing nations that have fed the world through their resources have failed to be able to feed themselves. Yet, and very worryingly, there's enough food to go around. So why then is it not being distributed accordingly? One only has to take a look at the famine suffered by those in Africa to realise that hunger is not only a byproduct of the global environment, which can deliver or destroy crops of food, but it's also the greed and egoistic nature of man that leads to people starving for food.
Well, unfortunately, the number of hungry people in Africa is increasing as part of the global setup. It's quite a significant portion of hungry and malnourished and people whose livelihoods are in crisis. So the main problem in Africa at the moment is security and conflict. Something like a half of the global hungry people live in countries with conflict situations, and Africa, unfortunately, is one of the main centres of that.
As just mentioned, one of the main issues facing countries in the African and West region area is conflict. Take, for example, South Sudan, recently emerged as a new nation, yet still undergoing a civil conflict caused by the power vacuum left behind. On top of the war, the impact of the environment is also playing a part, leaving the people at a very high risk of famine.
South Sudan's in trouble, serious trouble, not just because of the conflict, but because of the rains and the flooding that's hit in the last few months. It's much worse than we anticipated. And in fact, if we don't get $100 million in the next few weeks and next month, we literally are talking about a famine in the next few months. We need support, we need help, and we need it now.
In West Asia, conflict again is a major issue, with the people of Yemen being one of the most food-deprived nations in the world, with UN figures stating that over 20 million Yemenis are food insecure, with nearly 2 million children undernourished or on the verge of starvation, and with 80% of the population now relying on humanitarian assistance in order to survive. Furthermore, another nation in which hunger is a major issue is Palestine, with figures stating that prior to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus, some 32.7% of the population of Palestine could not afford nutritious food. To make matters worse, the Gaza Strip alone sees 68.5% of its people labelled as food insecure. Both Yemen and Palestine are examples of how hunger is being used as part and parcel of a war by oppressive forces, showing that food, water and access to a balanced diet from childhood to adulthood is not being considered by those imposing these conflicts, be it in Africa, West Asia or indeed anywhere else in the world.
One of the main contributors to world hunger is, of course, poverty. And with this being most abundant in developing countries, it is no wonder that around 98% of world hunger actually exists in underdeveloped nations. Most badly affected are children, with estimates suggesting that around 20,000 children die every day from hunger around the world. Many developing countries, around 1 in 5 children that die from hunger are under the age of 5. Truly heartbreaking, I'm sure you'll agree. Whilst hunger is a global problem, there are 2 specific areas suffering more than others, with some 526 million people living in hunger in Asia, and around 25% of the world's total amount of hungry people actually live in Africa, with 1 in 4 of those in Africa already in hunger finding themselves on the verge of starvation.
It's not just the likes of developing nations that are facing hunger, as advanced nations are also facing huge food issues, from lack of food in poor areas to lack of quality food in more wealthy areas. The US is no exception to the rule. With as many as 38 million people living in poverty, hunger is a major issue for those caught in the poverty trap. Some 11 million children in the US go hungry each night, with some 56% of households that are food insecure, relying on federal food assistance programs in order to obtain any kind of meal. When one looks into the areas of the United States with the most hunger, the figures raise an alarming pattern. With Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, New Mexico, Kentucky, Maine and Oklahoma all being in the lowest proportion of food-safe states, one can't help but notice that the majority of those states mentioned have large black and Latino populations, once again showing signs of discrimination from within. However, as mentioned earlier, not all food issues in developed nations are due to a lack of food, but some are due to the poor quality of food. For example, fast food, takeaways, and of course processed food, all contributing to health problems not too dissimilar from having no food at all.
I think the problem with developed nations is more one of obesity. So you can define malnutrition in a number of different ways. And I suppose we tend to think of it being a shortage of food, don't we? Or at least the spectrum of different nutritions not being readily available in the food that we buy locally in the supermarket. And in developed countries, we tend to consume very highly processed foods, which don't tend to deliver nutrition in the way that we consider suitable.
Food waste is also a major issue in developed nations, with many shops, supermarkets and people throwing away food at an alarming rate. With so much food being wasted, schemes have been set up to distribute waste food to those who need it most. Yet, there are still many missing out. Yet in the US alone, some 150,000 tons of food are thrown away or wasted each day. With the impact of the coronavirus leaving so many out of work and out of business in the US, one can only imagine how many more people will join the food distribution programs as they try to make ends meet and feed their families in both a cheap and healthy way.
Joining me in the studio today is Tim Benton, Research Director for the Environment and Resources Program at Chatham House, Professor of Population Ecology from the University of Leeds, and former UK Global Food Security Champion. He's also worked closely with the UK government, the EU, and G20. Professor Benton, many thanks for being with us today. So, first up, let's look at a key question. Why is world hunger still a major global problem? And is the rising world population a major factor, or are we looking at an underlying issue at hand here?
That's a very straightforward question to answer at one level, and that is there is plenty of food in the world. It's not getting to the right people, so we still have a very significant number of people who don't have access to the sorts of food that the rest of us enjoy. But there isn't at the moment a problem in the supply.
Okay, what about population growth? Is that a factor in world hunger?
And when you look ahead over the next 20, 30, 40 years, there is plenty of capacity within the world to grow more food, and there's plenty of capacity within the food system to reduce waste and so on. So the total supply of food should not be a problem on a global basis, despite rising population growth.
Looking at food security, a major issue. You got mass displacement that's caused by hunger, environmental disasters, and conflict, all adding up to reasons why people actually are on the go. Will then food security follow those who are displaced, and will it cause a problem for areas in which they move to, do you think?
Yeah, I think the COVID-19 is showing us how fragile our global systems are. And COVID is an example of the sorts of things that increasing climate change and environmental breakdown will throw at us. And I think it does really highlight the issues that for many people in many parts of the world, they live in fragile environments, they don't have access to a lot of money, there isn't necessarily the food around locally, and we can expect, as we look ahead, increasing situations where people, particularly in low and middle income countries, don't have access to the sorts of foods we enjoy. And if those are underlain by land degradation and serious climate change, that might lead to people movement and a whole host of other things that would follow from that.
Okay, there are multiple reasons why developing nations in the world may be suffering from hunger and famine. But then why do you think we're looking at this phenomenon in developed nations around the world, which is a surprise? Is there a rich-poor divide, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, as COVID has shown us, whilst there is generally a distributional problem in the rich world to do with food at the moment, there is really an access problem for those people who are on low incomes or can't get into shops, etc. They suffer chronic food insecurity, and in the UK, millions of people have suffered from not being able to get food in the past months, and the data that's coming in shows that that is not just a COVID thing, that is something that has been going on for a very long time. So I think the issue is that whilst on average there is enough food in the world, and there will be enough food in the world in future, those that have lots of money and have no access issues are free to use it, but for those that are constrained in some way, it becomes really difficult. So all around the world, every country is seeing people who don't have access to enough food on a daily basis.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Tim Benton from the University of Leeds. Thanks for joining us. Okay, we're about to take a quick break here on Economic Divide. Don't go anywhere, as there's plenty more coming up after the break. We're going to take a look at how other regions of the world are dealing with world hunger, as well as examining whether food security will become an issue in the near future, in particular as the world population rises and resources become scarcer. We're also going to take a look at other economic news headlines hitting the front pages, as well as talking to our regular current affairs and impact analyst, Mahan Abedin, as he runs us through some of the stories being discussed on social media. So sit right where you are. We'll be right back. Joining me in the studio is Mahan Abedin, our current affairs and impact analyst. Well, Mahan, welcome. This thing with world hunger, we knew it existed, but there's two things about it that's interesting that I'm thinking you're going to point out. One of them is the fact that it's turned out to be a pandemic of some kind. Of which the UN has issued a warning, and the other, how it's actually affecting developed nations. If you can tell us about that in your first post that you have over here.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously the COVID crisis has exacerbated this issue, with the UN warning now that we're facing famines of biblical proportions. But the thing is, this is of course all readily avoidable. And let's not forget that famine is not just affecting the poor nations; it's affecting developed nations. In some cases, in a massive way. I think some 13, 14 million people in the UK go hungry every night. Millions of them children. The same in the US. You have tens of millions going hungry. So I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the UN makes these statements. I'm not entirely sure they've thought through the deep causes of this. I mean, why should people in the UK or in the US go hungry? Why
so what you're saying is maybe the COVID-19 highlighted what existed, which was not highlighted before.
I mean,
in terms of these countries like, let's say, the US and
the
UK.
The coronavirus crisis has brought all sorts of issues into sharp relief, and hunger is one of them. But of course, there are broader issues.
Sure.
And I'm not entirely sure that the UN is actually addressing this issue correctly, because if you're going to fix this problem, we have to fix it at a political level.
You have something over here that's interesting. It talks about, that you picked, it talks about food distribution.
Yes. So I mean, obviously, this is no secret. Enough food is produced to feed everybody. Now, there are many issues here. One is wastage, for example. I mean, we know in developed nations a lot of food is wasted. You just have to look at the supermarkets, for instance. One node of the economy where so much food is thrown away on a daily basis. Now, if there was and it's interesting how if, for instance, in the UK, for example, if you go picking at the bins of some of these supermarkets, they would arrest you for thieving. And issues like that. So that's one part of the problem, obviously.
Distribution, always. So let's go to the next one and see what this is about.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, an open secret, the fact that people actually producing the food in developing nations, be they in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, wherever, they're often the hungriest.
But this is sad. They're the ones who are helping bring about the food in whatever form or fashion.
Absolutely. But I think one item that's missing from here is that a lot of these communities, because there's sufficient support structures in place, in fact, they're beginning to overcome hunger. And I'm not pointing to the biggest examples in Africa or elsewhere where people are genuinely going hungry. But unlike societies in the West, there's kind of a sufficient framework in place where people, yes, there are food scarcity issues, but that doesn't mean that people necessarily go hungry at night.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your input. We appreciate it. Mohan Abedin, our current affairs and impact analyst. Okay, coming up in the next report, you're going to see how this food shortage is exacerbated by, obviously, the COVID-19. And we're going to look at the way that there's dilemmas in how world hunger is being dealt with as a whole.
The grand old food problem is not something that's limited to just a few select countries, be this in the US where food is wasted or the diet is poor, nor is it limited to places where conflict and environmental issues play a part. But elsewhere in the world, food shortages are an alarming part of everyday life for many. In the UK, for example, levels of food insecurity are among some of the highest in Europe. In fact, some 14 million people in the UK live in poverty, with some 4 million of these being children, who are only often able to eat a decent meal through their schools. Many of these rely on government vouchers to get those free school meals. The current government had considered scrapping the school meal voucher over the summer in order to save costs. Yet it took the likes of Manchester United football player Marcus Rashford, who himself relied on school meals to eat as a kid, to convince the government to make a U-turn on the policy, which they duly did, when succumbed to the pressure imposed by Rashford. Furthermore, people in the UK are turning to food banks in order to eat, with the UK's largest food bank, the Trussell Trust, claiming that it alone gave out 1.6 million food parcels to people in need in 2019, which prior to the impact of the coronavirus is a figure that's much lower than the current number, which has more than certainly risen. Southern Asia is also an area of the world experiencing major issues when it comes to food and hunger. And one may argue that with the area having the largest proportion of the world's population, the sheer numbers of people could be a factor in why so many people are going hungry. But apparently, this is not the case.
It's not so much population, because the economies in South Asia, India and Bangladesh and Pakistan, but particularly the India and Bangladesh, have been improving in recent years. So India has had a year-on-year growth of 8%. Which makes it the second most rapidly growing large economy in the world in the last 10 years. Bangladesh also has improved its nutrition situation, and both countries, I think, are right in the front line of climate change, and one worries particularly that the monsoon regime might become unstable in years to come. And being heavily populated countries with people reliant upon water irrigation and also rainfall agriculture, this could lead to severe difficulties in future.
It's time now for our Info News section, where we take a look at news from the four corners of the world. First, a look at the U.S. This headline shows the disappointment of foreign students in that country. The Trump administration has exploited the pandemic to effectively shut down all immigration. This comes as famous Ivy League universities like Harvard and MIT have taken legal steps to stop Trump's visa rules. Next up, tensions between India and China sees no signs of letting up. Indian nomads have said the Chinese forces have been stealing their land for years. The current border standoff that turned fatal last month could have lasting implications for the global economy, since, if true, this could push India's Prime Minister Modi towards Trump. And final stop, Israel. Thousands staged a demonstration in Tel Aviv to protest against what they said was economic hardships caused by the officials' mishandling of the coronavirus crisis. Small businesses, self-employed workers, and performing artist groups said that officials have not done enough. Time now for a look at food security and which countries are experiencing this very troubling phenomenon. COVID-19 to have surely compounded the problem.
If food becomes more scarce and water dries up, the consequences of such events go far beyond the notion of people going hungry and thirsty. It becomes an issue of food security. Man's natural survival instinct, obtained from his hunter-gatherer days, will move him onto new pastures in order to feed himself and his family. However, modern times come with modern issues, one of which being land borders between nations. The simple fact that a reservoir may dry up in one area no longer means that a quick journey may lead him to new waters, as those waters now may be in a different territory or country, hence creating a food security dilemma. Should this happen on a wider scale, say for example an entire country experiencing famine or drought, then the possibility of a wave of migrants heading elsewhere brings with it serious concerns.
Food security does not mean only that enough food is produced and that all people have access to the food. Food security also means that all food must be safe for consumption. So food security cannot be dissociated from food safety.
It's not just the amount of food available that poses a food security risk, but also the quality of food. As seen earlier, those in the West eating fast and processed foods are becoming obese. But for those in developing nations, poor food quality is also something that must be taken very seriously. But the issue of food insecurity is more than just a short-term issue, with the problem having been around for many years. But the main factor when dealing with this has yet to be performed on a multi-level scale, meaning that we're each responsible for dealing with world hunger, food security, and famine.
It seems that as the world grows in numbers and the planet struggles to keep pace with the ever-growing amount of mouth to feed, so then do we see a saddening direct result of this, namely a rise in world hunger. Whereas many NGOs and charities perform honorable work in helping those in need, it seems that there's never enough to help everyone, with many nations seeing their respective governments barely able to help those in poverty, let alone those who are better faring. Yet the sad truth is that hunger is no longer a poor nation problem, with many developed and in fact highly advanced nations facing a hunger crisis as both income dries up to buy food, poverty sets in, and food security adds to the global crisis, keeping those below the breadline. Don't forget, we always want to hear from you and share your stories, so don't forget to tag us into your social media accounts using @ED_program. You can watch this episode and all of our previous episodes online by visiting our website, where there are shows available 24/7 for you to catch up on. In the meantime, that's just about it for this week's show. I've been Kavit Hathaway on behalf of myself and the whole team here on Economic Divide. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.